Hi guys. So someone recently asked me the question, how do I play and fill out a melody from a lead sheet so that it doesn't sound boring? So I will attempt to answer that question in this video. Now, those of you coming from a classical background are used to playing a song exactly as written on the sheet music. But in jazz, we have the exact opposite situation, where you never want to play a song exactly as written. Now, this is often a bit of a paradigm shift for classical musicians. Most of the time when we're playing jazz, we're using lead sheets. Now, these are designed to give you just the skeleton of the song, just the basic chords and a simplified melody. For this reason, if you play a lead sheet exactly as written, it's going to sound incredibly boring. Instead, you're supposed to take that skeleton of a song and add on jazz piano techniques, like a walking bass line, and interpret or jazz up the melody so that overall your performance, the thing you actually play, sounds quite interesting. And in terms of the melody, there's really just a few things you need to do to turn the melody from a really boring simplified version to an interesting and jazzy version, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. But first, let's take section A of All the Things You Are and play it with a walking bass line in the left hand, while the right hand plays the melody exactly as it's written in the lead sheet. Right, so that was incredibly boring. And the main reason for this is that on the lead sheet, the notes are all written out to be played on the beat. So we don't get any sense of swing or syncopation that is integral to jazz. So the first thing that you need to do is to change the rhythm of the melody so that we are occasionally playing melody notes on offbeats. So this essentially means that we change the duration of the notes and where the notes land in the bar. And often bringing a melody note half a beat earlier or pushing it half a beat later, so using anticipation or delay, is particularly effective. So for example, I could play this. Right, so already that melody sounds a lot more interesting. I'm not just playing notes on the beat. Sometimes I'm delaying the melody note by half a beat or 1.5 beats. Sometimes I'm bringing the melody note forward by half a beat. And that kind of push and pull in the timing and the fact that we're now using offbeats, which in a swing rhythm, creates a lot more interest and adds that sense of swing and syncopation. Now, the next thing you can do to give the melody even more excitement and movement is to embellish the melody by adding extra notes, especially repeating melody notes over and over, and using chromatic passing notes, where if your melody moves down by a whole step, you get there by moving down chromatically through a chromatic passing note, which is one of the things I'm going to do in All the Things You Are. You can also add fills in between the melody notes. So if you have a long note where nothing happens or a rest, you can put in a little bit of improvisation essentially, but a really short improvisation before getting back to the melody. And you do this by adding in arpeggios of the chord that you're on, and by doing little scale runs, either the diatonic scale run. So for example, we start in A flat major in All the Things You Are, so I could do a little A flat major scale run, or chromatic scales always sound good in almost all contexts. And finally, adding ornamentals, so adding occasional grace notes or trills, or little embellishments, little ornamentals to just zhuzh up your melody a tiny bit. So again, for example, I could do this. So again, that sounds even more interesting, exciting, and jazzy. So I added a little run down the A flat major scale down to the melody note G. I added little grace notes when I was repeating notes. I added a chromatic passing note to connect the G down to the F. And at the end, when the melody just sits on the E, I put in a little, chromatic-ish fill to fill out the empty space. So there's a lot more movement, there's a lot more stuff happening, and again, we still have that sense of syncopation because there are lots of notes that are being played on an offbeat. But it still sounds a little bit hollow because we are playing a single line in our left hand with the walking bass line, and we're still only playing a single line, so one note at a time, in our right hand. So it sounds a little bit polyphonic. So to really make this melody interesting and to fatten it up a bit and liven it up a bit, we want to add some harmony in this. We want to harmonize our melody, or essentially add the chords in occasionally into our melody. So this can be done by playing the chords in between the melody. So if you've got a long melody note or a rest, you could use that gap in the melody, the break, to play a chord, for example. You could play the relevant chord with the melody note on top, so you're essentially harmonizing the melody note with the full chord. You could play little passing chords, and chromatic approach chords work particularly well. So for example, I'm going to play the E flat 7 chord in All the Things You Are, and I'm going to use a chromatic approach chord, so a chord a semitone higher, an E7 chord, to lead into that E flat 7 chord. And you can also harmonize the melody with a particular interval. Usually thirds and sixths work particularly well. So again, doing this, you could create something as follows. Now this is a really great sounding and jazzy sounding melody that is infinitely more interesting than our first example where we were just playing on the beat. Now obviously it takes time and practice to be able to fill out a melody like this and to take a really boring simplified melody from a lead sheet and build it out into something a little bit more listenable like this. But to get there, all you need to do is practice adding one element at a time. So take the melody and change the rhythm. Then take the melody and maybe add some grace notes. And take the melody and keep the grace notes and add a little fill over a long note. So gradually, one by one, add in these techniques so you're not sort of overwhelmed and dive straight into the deep end where you try and do all these techniques all at the same time. But eventually, as you add on more and more of these techniques, you're going to move away from that really boring, simplified sounding melody like I played at the beginning with All the Things You Are, and create a lot more movement, a lot more density by adding more notes in with your chords and your harmony, and a lot more syncopation, and just a lot more interest in your melody. And really, embellishing your melody like this is sort of almost on the cusp of improvising. In fact, historically, going way, way back to when jazz first began in the early 20th century, improvising was often just seen as embellishing the melody, kind of like this. It's only later as jazz grew and matured that the idea of having a completely separate improvisation that's not at all based on the melody kind of developed and grew into its own, so that you could play, the melody at the beginning, then improvise, then the melody at the end. But you're still kind of improvising during the melody stages by doing all these things, by changing the rhythm, by adding little ornamentals and embellishments, by adding harmony wherever you can and little fills. So it's not clear cut what improvisation and what melody is. They're not completely mutually exclusive. There's a lot of overlap between those two things in jazz. And so if you listen to all the greats, you won't actually hear them play the melody as written or in the same way every time. Every time they play the melody, there are going to be some differences and nuances and variations to that melody, because that's the kind of dynamic nature of jazz that makes it really interesting to listen to. Cool, hopefully this was interesting and you found it somewhat useful. Otherwise, thank you for watching and I will see you next time. Bye guys.